In the last 2 weeks, the game has seen a couple of managers canned, Bud Black of the Rockies and Derek Shelton of the Pirates, and as I've said on other occasions, they may have been helping, they may have been hurting, but the messes they found themselves in were not of their own design. This struck me very powerfully this week when I read the remarks of Brooklyn Dodgers president Larry McPhail upon hiring Leo DeRocher, Leo the Lip, to be his manager in October 1938. It was Leo's first job, so he was an unknown quality as a skipper. Reporters were asking how McPhail thought he would be, what qualities he brought to the job, and those sorts of general questions. And finally, McPhail said, very wisely, and he wasn't always wise, "This fellow will be as good a manager as we can make him." The Dodgers hadn't won a pennant in 18 years, so that must have been obvious. And it seemed to me, in light of Shelton and Black, that they too were only as good as their teams could make them, but the teams themselves, the front offices and the owners, hadn't fulfilled their ends of the bargain. And I wished that there was kind of truth in labeling, a full disclosure when those sorts of transactions, those sorts of changes happen. Don Kelly is now the manager of the Pirates. Warren Schaefer now running the Rockies. He's 0-3 as I speak these words. Imagine at their introductory press conferences if their owners or general managers had said, "Warren is only going to be as good as we can make him, but we're not going to bother to do anything for him. We've hardly efforted in that direction before, haven't for years, so why should we start now? What's so special about this guy that you think he deserves that? What's so special about you?" You suckers, you rubes. Have a hot dog. Yes, it's the American way of say a lot and do a little and rake in the bucks anyway, as expressed in such classic works as The Octopus, The Jungle, and our present dystopia, soon to be its own land, complete with log flume and souvenir keychain, as presented in that haunted theme park we know as the Infinite Inning. And welcome back to the show, The Infinite Inning, episode number 331 in an ongoing series. I am Stephen Goldman, just like Mr. Rourke, your host, but I don't wear a white suit. In fact, right now, I'm wearing a Dark Knight Returns t-shirt. The cover of issue number 1 depicted Sans logo. Some of you will understand exactly what I'm referring to. I've got great literature like that on my mind today. In his novel The Confidence Man, Herman Melville asked, "What creature but a madman would not rather do good than ill? When it is plain that, good or ill, it must return upon himself." The answer is the man who does not believe that deeds will redound upon him either way. It's like those sinning skeptics in the book of Zephaniah. The prophet says that the Lord's wrath will fall upon those men who say in their heart, "The Lord shall do neither good nor harm," meaning they're immune because there is no God and God's not going to do anything anyway, even if there is one. And, well, that's how many people operate nowadays. Chance it. There probably won't be any punishment anyway. And that, my friends, is Pete Rose, the musical. So how are ya? I'm pretty mad. I'm not going to go into great detail about Pete Rose and Rob Manfred's decision except by allegory in the next segment of the show. You will have noticed that our first bit was only about 3 minutes long when usually it's 10 to 15 minutes. That's because I have 2 other bits for you, and I wanted to start the theme song before the show was 30 minutes old. Have you had that experience on modern TV of late? Post-peak TV, whatever it is that we're supposed to be experiencing now, where you started the latest episode of whatever show you're into, and a lot of time has gone by. You've been involved with the show, so you haven't exactly been watching the clock, but suddenly you might turn to the person watching with you and say, "Have we seen the credits yet?" whether you press that skip button or not, did that opportunity come up? And then it happens and you say, oh, the last half hour was the teaser? You mean we're only starting the story now? And yeah, I know I've been guilty of that here on the Infinite Inning. Structure is hard, especially when you feel like a story should be the length that it needs to be told in the right way. So whereas way back when I conceived the show, I thought, well, we'll do a quick segment, maybe like 5 minutes, and then we'll roll the theme song, and then the next segment will be like half an hour to 45 minutes. It just never has worked out that way because I have too many details I want to share with you. And you could say that that's a flaw or a fault on my part. But if so, let us make the most of it and have a good time spending time together and telling stories that, as always, hope to illuminate the present via a trip to the past, the time machine, more often than not being the great American game of baseball, a microcosm of greater American society and sometimes the world as a whole. You can take whole either way. W-H-O-L-E was the way I initially meant it, but it works the other way too. H-O-L-E, the world as a whole. Speaking of which, I wrote at BP about the Pete Rose situation. That's why I'm not going to go into it in fantastic detail here. If you want my sincere, on-the-spot reaction, there's a piece called Rob Manfred Makes Way for the Trojan Corpse at Baseball Prospectus, Trojan Corpse being Mr. Rose himself, because this is not about him. This is about someone else's agenda and the kind of assault on responsibility and consequences that has been ubiquitous, not just since January, but going back now years. Where do you want to draw the line on a precedent? Do you want to do it with Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon? Do you want to do it when Iran-Contra shredded the rule of law in 20 different ways? Do you want to do it when the run-up to the war of choice in Iraq involved all sorts of ginned-up false intelligence? It just goes on and on. No one ever takes responsibility for anything. Only lesser people wind up in prison, and society continues to down spiral. Can I give you an example? Because baseball wouldn't work either if it were run the way that we're running our civilization, our country right now. Think back to the first blush of free agency back in the 1970s. Reggie Jackson, who Charlie Finley knows is not going to sign back with the Oakland A's because, one, he can't pay, and two, everyone involved with the Oakland A's thinks Charlie Finley is kind of an ass. So Reggie's traded to the Orioles for, among others, Don Baylor, and that's going to be his launching pad into free agency. Now, the Yankees in our reality, did not know that they were going to end up with Reggie Jackson. Their first target was actually Bobby Grich. Bobby Grich preferred in the end, A, not to play shortstop for the Yankees, and B, to go back to California where he was from. So Reggie was their second choice. But let's pretend, again, for this hypothetical, that in 1976, George Steinbrenner understood very well that he wanted Reggie to be in the Bronx in 1977. And just to underscore his good feelings, his affection for Reggie, he gave Reggie, let's say in May of 1976, an airplane, a personal jet, a private plane. There are no strings attached. Reggie just has his own 747 now. Now, if you happen to be an Orioles fan at the time, or maybe even a highly ethical Yankees fan, you might say, gee, this is inappropriate. This feels wrong. This feels a bit like a bribe meant to influence Reggie's coming free agency. And with this on your mind, you head over to whatever the 1976 version of social media was, basically two tin cans tied together by a string, and you note that a New York Times reporter says, it's not bribery. You have to go by the rules, and the rules say that there has to be an explicit quid pro quo. And in one sense, that's true, because the Supreme Court does not believe, as presently constituted, in bribery, and has narrowed the definition so thoroughly that it's very hard to prove that someone has been bribed unless you literally catch them receiving money with one hand and handing back a get-out-of-jail-free card with the other. And that about never happens. In the song Straw Man from his classic album, New York, Lou Reed sang, "Does anyone need another politician caught with his pants down and money sticking in his hole?" That's about even then, That's not necessarily bribery. Maybe the money just happened to be there. Maybe that's where he keeps his wallet. And that may well be the way the rules work now, but we don't have to be so naive that we can't call a thing what it is. And in baseball, Reggie's airplane would not be called a bribe. It would be called tampering. But the essence of the tampering charge would be a bribe, a gift meant to influence a future decision on the part of a player who is not presently your employee. The quid pro quo, if any, would come later when Reggie signed the contract, perhaps even signed it on terms you find favorable. Now, is there harm in that? There might have been if the Orioles had hoped to re-sign Reggie and couldn't compete on that basis, but then again, once Reggie achieved free agency, the Yankees could court him in any way that they wanted to. Take him out to expensive dinners, show him around the town, take him and his wife to a Broadway show or three, all of which typically happens when the Yankees entertain a potential free agent signee. And sometimes they sign and sometimes they don't. Turned out Greg Maddux, when he came to New York before going from the Cubs to the Braves, not into show tunes. The musicals were wasted on him. But fine, that's the kind of thing that you do. But that's where my analogy breaks down, because there's a difference between trying to get a right fielder or a great starting pitcher to choose between two ball clubs when they are free agents and there are no particular rules about what blandishments you can offer them, including, as the Dodgers have discovered, delaying the payments out to the heat death of the universe. But when the person being courted with the airplanes, with the show tunes, with the expensive dinners, is responsible for making decisions on the behalf of and theoretically to the benefit or detriment of 330 million people, then you really want them to not be open to receiving obvious flattery or bribery. You want them to make that decision objectively. Whereas Reggie or any free agent can make the call in any way that he wants to. Look at Aaron Judge's, just to stick with the Yankees for a minute, free agency a couple of years ago. It really came down to, did he want to stick with the Yankees or did he want to, like Bobby Grich many years before, play closer to where he grew up? He decided he could stick with the Bronx, and that was that. Only people harmed, Giants fans and whatever friends and family Judge had who wanted him back in California. The leader of the free world, his choices are a bit more significant. I should mention briefly, as I have the last couple of shows, that The Infinite Inning is now available on YouTube. It has been getting some, well, not views, because there's no visual. As I've explained, you don't really want to see me. Again, maybe you do want to see my cool Dark Knight t-shirt, but again, you could just buy the book because it's the cover. It's just the audio of the show, and it's there in case that is your delivery vehicle of choice. And people have started to notice, and it's nice, but I'm still a bit perplexed by the whole thing, but it's what you're supposed to do. The one thing I cannot imagine myself saying is mash that like and subscribe button, but if revenue from YouTube can help support me in doing this so I can do more of this for you for longer, I guess I'm all for it. In other words, if you are listening to the show on YouTube, first of all, hello, and then second of all, yeah, mash that like and subscribe button. I have no shame. Speaking of no shame, speaking of revenue, it is about time for us to take a break before I plunge into the second segment of the show. Again, we'll have 3 acts today minimum with 2 different stories. The first kind of, again, is inspired by what Rob Manfred did without duplicating what I wrote on Baseball Prospectus, and it doesn't stay on that. It goes a lot of other places in my typical digressive style. We'll get to a few ancient popes, and then we'll get to the Orioles, and the current Orioles, I should say, and eventually their antecedents with the Browns, because as I've said before, there's just a huge unserved St. Louis Browns audience that is waiting for us to discover each other, them and me. Hasn't happened in 8 years of doing the show, but I know it's like the mother and child reunion, the Browns and me. It's only a motion away, whatever that means. Before we go, I should mention 2 other things briefly. When the whole all these players have been sprung from the ban list thing broke this week, a few people asked me, why was Hal Chase not taken off the ban list? The answer is that Hal Chase was never on the ban list. In fact, during his later life, he wrote to Commissioner Landis and said, have I been banned? And Landis said, not that I know of. but nothing really came of that because he still wasn't welcome. He was formally banned from the Pacific Coast League, which is a story we've discussed in a prior episode. Maybe I should make that the next reissue. Speaking of which, the second reissue episode came out. You might have seen that. This one goes all the way back to episode 6, which was primarily about the infielder Snooks Dowd, who wasn't wanted where he was, and vice versa. And once again, I put in about 15 minutes of speechifying at the beginning of talking to you about current events, baseball and otherwise, and I hope you welcome that. Even if you don't listen to the rest of it, maybe you would enjoy this additional interaction between us. At least I hope so. It was kind of funny to me that folks were like, oh, do we get Hal Chase back now? I mean, he wasn't really a Hall of Famer to begin with, although if he had been on the up and up and played just a little bit longer, he may well have gotten there. He really wasn't very much of a hitter, even for the dead ball era, but folks did think that highly of his glove work around the first base bag that between his .291 career average, or whatever it would have worked out to be, and well over 2,000 hits, and he had about 2,100 as it was, he probably would have gotten in via the early voters. But he couldn't help himself. And so we're already talking about something that's unrealistic and impossible. But the upshot is that he wasn't on the ban list because I think once he went to the Giants in 1919, and even John McGraw couldn't slow down the game throwing, the other 15 teams said, you know what, we don't need this. But as I said, we do need something, and that is to take a break. On the other side, an adventure with early Orioles pitching, which may or may not have a bit of a brown tinge to it. Ew. As I said, I don't want to duplicate or spend too much more time on the rose that is Pete, the anti-rose that is Pete. Keyword tense, was Pete, not is Pete. But I was amused that if you've been listening to the show of late, I inadvertently prepared you to know a lot more about what Manfred did, because I spent both a regular and a reissue episode talking about Shufflin' Phil Douglas. Manfred, to give himself cover, not only said that Pete Rose's banishment ended with his demise, but so did that of the 8 Black Sox and 4 Giants who had been in a variety of bizarre schemes, all of which we've talked about on the show in the past. And I guess we can get back to those episodes thanks to the reissue series. And one of them was Shufflin' Phil. And I find myself moved because, as I've said in the last couple of episodes, Phil was dumb, and Phil had so thoroughly pickled his mind with help from various quack and team doctors, and that may be redundant, who had been administering sedatives to him over and over again on top of all the booze. And as I said last week, those lovely, lovely laxatives, he didn't know what the hell he was doing. And again, he didn't ask to be bribed to throw a game. He just asked to be bribed to go home, which is what ended up happening. He got his wish. They punished him with what he was trying to get paid to do. The only difference was they kept the money, and did he and his wife and his 2 kids suffer for that? And that's the part that I find painful, because poor Shufflin' Phil didn't know what the hell had happened to him. He did accept responsibility for it mostly, and he had just no way of making a living because the 2 things he did well were pitch and imbibe. And I don't know how long he might have managed to do either if he had not written the letter that got him placed on the banished list. But he did. He was around until 1952, and there are some very sad stories of reporters either going out to interview him or him seeking them out, and every time he's inebriated, and often he needs money. So when I think about what he went through, or Buck Weaver went through, and don't get me wrong, Buck Weaver had guilty knowledge, and Buck Weaver probably should have been banned. I know that's a controversial opinion. If someone in that whole situation deserved to be let out, it might have been Buck. But the fact is that he was a conspirator, and even if he didn't follow through, even if he had regrets, even if that were true of Joe Jackson, which it might have been, although he took the money, Buck was also trying to be true to his teammates or loyal to his teammates and not break the code of silence, the clubhouse code. And so I have some sympathy for his position. I have some sympathy for what Phil Douglas went through. I have zero sympathy for the knowing transgressions of Pete Rose, because don't forget, Buck Weaver and the Black Sox, shuffling Phil in his way, they set precedents. Pete Rose knew that what he was doing was wrong. I did find it an odd coincidence that Rose was dug up the week after a new pope was named, because throughout that process, I kept thinking of one of the more macabre papal transitions. I'm sure you know this one, and likely you know more about it than I do, because I'm hardly a student of these things, but in the year 897 of the Common Era, 13 years before the year 1000, in other words, Pope Stephen VI dug up one of his predecessors, Pope Formosus. We haven't had a Formosus in a while, who had been moldering in his grave for about a year, and Stevie had Formosus dressed up in his pope gear, propped him up on a chair, and put him on trial for being an unworthy pope. Certainly we have all had those kinds of days. Formosus's testimony in his own defense was notably lacking in animation, and so he was convicted, pulled out of the chair, stripped, mutilated, and dumped in the Tiber. And this changed nothing, because Formosus was, in every way that mattered, in the books. Once you're done, it's all just commentary, with or without a body in a chair. They also could have pulled Formosus out of storage, praised him, and put a golden crown on his head, and it wouldn't have changed the record even slightly. It's not a comment on the dead man, it's a reflection of the people who are here now, and an agenda so powerful that they've got to desecrate a corpse, and their inability to let the record be the record and do their own thing, tell their own story, and accomplish their own achievements without insisting that other people venerate or despise their household saints or ancient enemies. The phrase, you do you, it works in a lot of different directions, and it doesn't just mean be yourself, but let other people alone. Let them make their judgments based on who you are, not on who someone else is or was. To be less general, we've learned nothing new about Pete Rose. What has happened, in fact, is perhaps the opposite of what was intended. Greater attention has been placed on his sins against the games and also with the little girls. And a lot has been said about the ones in power who stump for him, those who celebrate him in spite of his flaws is too weak a word, and the commissioner who prostituted his authority to curry favor with power. Speaking of which, indirectly, something adjacent to those who are in power. As I speak these words, here's one of my more awkward transitions, but we're going to drop Pete now, not into the Tiber, but wherever they found him. As I speak these words, the old Baltimore Orioles have a record of 15-27. That puts them on a pace to finish the year with a record of 58-104. Now, Pacoda figures it's not that bad and sees them bouncing up a lot and finishing at something like 78-84. To do that, they'll have to play a bit over 500 the rest of the way, and it's not impossible. They've had a lot of injuries on offense and pitching, and players like Adley Rutschman have dramatically underperformed. He might wake up. Gunnar Henderson, who got a late start due to injury, should continue to play better, and so on. But what the projection system can't know is if, somewhere between now and the end of July, the Orioles figure that they're out of it and trade away players on expiring contracts like pitcher Zach Eflin and DH Ryan O'Hearn, center fielder Cedric Mullins, and perhaps as well Pope Stephen VI. They absolutely should, and one imagines they probably will, so those moves could improve them for the future but weaken them for the rest of 2025, and thus take any projection with a grain of salt. Both Mullins and O'Hearn, by the by, are great stories. Mullin is not the world's greatest player. He's kind of a better Colby Rasmus, who actually, I think, more or less overlapped with him on the Orioles back in 2018. Rasmus was about to go away and Mullins was just coming up. The difference is that whereas Rasmus was a first-round draft pick of the Cardinals, who underachieved, Mullins was a 13th round draft pick who has overachieved. He was even the second to last pick in the round. Compare and contrast to, say, Andrew Benintendi, who the Red Sox made the 7th overall pick in that same 2015 draft. Baseball Reference fixes his wins above replacement at 15.9 to date. Mr. Mullins has also been worth 15.9 wins above replacement in his career thus far. I promise you the expectations based on those selections, where they were picked, were not nearly equal or parallel. Ryan O'Hearn is a platoon-designated hitter, first baseman, and corner outfielder. And no, that's not the same thing as having a great center fielder or shortstop, but it can help. The Royals drafted him in the 8th round in 2014, got a partial rookie season out of him in 2018 that was terrific. He slugged about .600 with 12 home runs in 149 at-bats. But then over the next 4 years, he just couldn't recapture that. They kept letting him try, and he just couldn't keep the playing time. He had hit for power in the minors, slugging nearly .500 on the way up. So, although no one this side of Aaron Judge should be expected to slug .600 on the regular, something solid against right-handed pitching was a very reasonable expectation. Over the next 4 years, though, he hit only .211 with a .282 on-base percentage and a .351 slugging percentage. In January 2023, the Royals sold him to the Orioles, and it just seemed like another deck chair added to the Titanic. But what only O'Hearn knew is that he had changed his swing, and in nearly 300 games since then, he's hit .277 with a .335 on-base percentage and a .458 slugging percentage, and would look pretty interesting with, say, the Mets. It's hard to believe that the Orioles are in this position. Going back to their last championship in 1983, the Orioles have had all these years of misery, punctuated by the occasional false dawn, including playoff appearances in 1996 and 97, every other year, 2012, 2014, 2016, and practically yesterday, 2023 and 2024. They won 101 games in 23. They changed owners too. New guy, supposed to be more munificent, less parsimonious than the Angelos clan. And yet, this past winter, they let Corbin Burns go, defensible, but replaced him only with pitch-to-contact import Tomoyuki Sugano and good old Charlie Methuselah Morton. Sugano has been about as good as possibly could have been expected so far, but Morton, who's 41, reminds me so much of being a Yankees fan in the mid-1980s and having to drag myself through school and the late afternoon and demands from parents and so on just to get to a game started by Joe Niekro. And no offense to either Joe or Charlie, both of whom were great pitchers at times, but in both cases, that was then and this is now. I have sort of wonderful memories of being at Yankee Stadium with a friend who is still more like a brother to me than a friend on May 30th, 1987. I know this one by heart. And watching balls hit by Terry Steinbeck and Mike Davis off of flat Joe Niekro knuckleballs as they sailed deep into the Bronx night. The opposing pitcher was Joaquin Andujar, so it was sort of a past their prime 2-for-1 special for me back then in the Reagan administration. About a month back, Orioles general manager Mike Elias, looking at what has been the worst pitching staff in baseball, said at no point had they forecast so many injuries to their pitchers, which is just an amazing thing for a general manager to say, given that getting hurt is all pitchers do, all they've ever done. Look at the Dodgers. They usually lose 10 pitchers by April 15th, but they keep winning by patching with depth. Elias said, "We have already tapped into basically the depth." For the Dodgers to say that would be tantamount to the French walking into that rail car at Compiègne and surrendering to the Germans. With the Orioles being back on the 100-loss beat, it occurred to me that they stopped playing in St. Louis 72 years ago. They've been the Baltimore Orioles over 20 years longer than they were the St. Louis Browns, and yet the idea of the good Orioles, the Earl Weaver and the Oriole Way Orioles, when you take the long view, turned out to be a roughly 20-year aberration out of roughly 125 years of this franchise's existence. And mulling that over, I started asking history the usual questions I tend to ask it, which is why history tells me to bug off a lot, about why the Browns had failed to build on the many good players they had had. A lot of the answers are the usual ones: incompetence, being in competition with the Cardinals in a city that didn't necessarily support two teams, owners who didn't have the do-re-mi to back the club, and then there was just this. Life happens. And here's a quick example. One of the best pitchers in Browns history, and very few pitchers answer to that description, was a tall lefty named Carl Weilman, of Hamilton, Ohio, near Cincinnati. Actual surname, Weilenman, 2 N's. Carl was 6'5" at a time when most Americans were about half that tall, give or take, and judging from the full body pictures, he had sort of a Chris Sale build. He didn't have Chris Sale stuff because very few pitchers, if anyone, aside from Walter Johnson, say, had Chris Sale stuff at that time, and Weilenman was more of a control guy, but both he and Sale have that vibe going for them of, I was just reincarnated having been a stork in a previous life, and the Board of Second Chances decided that a lot of those more storky qualities look good on me and kept them for the new model. And that's why tonight I'll be ordering the Frog and Snail special, thank you. If Carl was indeed a reincarnated stork, then that stork had come from Europe, as he was a first-generation American of Swiss and German parentage. His minor league career began in 1909 in the Bluegrass League. It was from there in 1912 that the Browns zapped him up to the majors. He got into 8 games his rookie year and went only 2-4 because it was the Browns. He put up a very nice 2.79 ERA in 48 1/3 innings with only 3 walks. He even pitched 2 shutouts. Oddly, both were games that lasted only 7 innings, and both were against the White Sox. In one of them, he beat Eddie Seacott, who, like Shuffle and Fill, is now off the banish list. And bonus, who relieved Eddie Seacott in that game? Shuffle and Fill himself. His first full season, not Shuffle and Phil's, but Carl's, was up and down. He went 10-19 with a 3.40 ERA, and that was well below league average at the time. There were still some fun games in there. On July 25th, the Senators knocked out Brownie starter George Baumgartner after a third of an inning, and Weilenman came on in relief. He went the rest of the way being 14 2/3 innings. You will not see Josh Hader doing that anytime soon. Tall Drink-a-Water Carl got to go to the plate 6 times in that pre-designated hitter era and went 0 for 6 with 6 strikeouts. Even more, unfortunately for him, the Senators, who, by the way, their starting first baseman in that game was Chick Gandil, mastermind of throwing a World Series and now eligible for the Hall of Fame alongside his best buddy Pete Rose. They also lost their starting pitcher early, and manager Clark Griffith decided to use Walter Johnson out of the pen. He pitched 11 1/3 innings and whiffed 15, and no one even got a decision. The whole thing ended in an 8-8 tie. For 3 years after that, though, Carl was really good. He was an ace-like pitcher for manager Branch Rickey, 1914 through 1916. Again, his one-loss records aren't great because the Browns weren't very good around him or aside from him, but over those 3 seasons, he went 52-49, so over 500, with a 2.19 ERA, pitching from 276 to 299 innings a year. So why haven't you heard of him? Why wasn't he, like some later Browns pitchers, traded away to another team where he could blossom like Urban Shocker winning World Series for the Yankees or Bobo Newsom doing the same for the Tigers? The short version is that he wasn't alive. He started off the 1917 season well, but he had to go home during the first week of May with what was described as kidney trouble. In reality, that was a vague understatement. Weilenman had renal tuberculosis. The bacteria probably started in his lungs, but then took a trip on the bloodstream highway downstairs and found a home in his urologic system and proceeded to destroy it. The doctors had to remove the diseased organ, one of his kidneys, and then and now, that's a serious surgery. Weilenman was obviously out for the year. As it turned out, he was out for all of 1918 as well, and it seemed like Carl's career was over. Not only is losing a kidney a serious thing to try to recover from, but losing a kidney doesn't cure tuberculosis, and he was still a very sick man. Yet, he did make a comeback in 1919. His season started late and ended early because of, quote, abdominal trouble, which was said to be related to his kidney surgery. But he was very good while he was around. He started 20 games and went 10-6 with a 2.07 ERA. He pitched 2 shutouts, and in both of those games, his starting second baseman was Joe Gedeon, who was banned for having advanced knowledge that the Black Sox were going to throw the World Series, but is now eligible for the Hall of Fame alongside his good buddy, Pete Rose. Well, Carl couldn't do that a second year in a row. And I don't mean surviving with Joe Gideon on the field behind him, but just pitching well despite his increasing infirmity. His 1920 season actually began strongly, with the tall guy pitching to a 2.94 ERA through his first 70 innings or so, but he was raked pretty regularly after that, which is a shame because the Browns were about to get good for a minute. In early February of the next season, or I should say the next year, he mailed in his retirement to Browns general manager Bob Quinn. He said he was forced to retire because, I quote, of an illness which had impaired his health to such an extent that he was not able to do justice to the team or himself, as he did in years gone by. The tuberculosis was starting to sap him. The Browns kept him on to scout, and he was with them in May of 1924 when he became not, well, ill, because he had been ill for years, but ill in a more serious way. He went home to Ohio and died in hospital about 3 days later. He was 34 years old. His only child, his daughter, was 7. She remained on the planet into 2011, 99 years after her dad had come to the big leagues. I was tempted to say that Carl's was an American story, but it would be wrong to say that a young man dying in the prime of his life of disease was a peculiarly American story. In fact, at that time, tuberculosis had been the way of humankind for thousands of years. We had no defense against it. It was endemic. Everyone carried it. Something like 75 to 90% of the people had it, but only a fraction of them developed the active disease, maybe 5 or 10%, and then some further subset of them had to leave, as Carl did. Using the 1920 census as our guide, in Carl's America, that means something like 70 to 90 million people were carriers, and anywhere from 3.5 million to 9 million became sick. Some people got it because one of those carriers coughed in their general direction, but maybe even more got it through consuming raw milk products. Then we adopted pasteurization and vaccines, and all of that came to an end for a while. And here's the good news. We can, just like Pope Stephen and Formosus, dig old Carl up, prop him up, and let him die of it again. Because who the hell was he to try to get out of it the first time? And all those other people since him who didn't drink bad milk, who got a shot rather than let a bacillus chaw through their lungs. Dig them up too and let them get red-pilled. They had it all backwards. Only the infected are strong and only the sick are healthy. And in short, that's why the St. Louis Browns never won any pennants and ended up moving to the East Coast. One kidney Carl should have been tougher. And as you mull that one over, but don't chaw it, we'll reserve that for the bacteria, it's time for one more break. On the other side, I have another discussion, this one somewhat lighter, that begins with a couple of instances of obstructed base runners. One that happened just this week, one that happened nearly 100 years ago, both of which kind of lead to the same place. So if you'll just watch your step as we round first base here, I'll be back on the other side. 2 Giants games with similar plays, but different decisions. I'll see you on the other side, I hope. While you were out during that break, I hope using the time in a valuable way. No pressure, but the Orioles just lost their 28th game, which drops their winning percentage under .350 and puts them on a pace for 106 losses. So what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, still true, but more true. And a couple of shows back, I talked about the Rockies being off to the worst start ever. They have since dropped below the 1932 Red Sox, for literally not tied for the worst start ever, but the absolute worst start ever through the number of games that they've played, which is now 43. And as we speak tonight, I'm not going to sweat this as much as I did last time, but they are trailing the Diamondbacks 3-0, top 4. Ladies and gentlemen, I love watching history in action, especially when it leads to some good failure analysis. And these two teams are really giving us some stuff to, again, chew on, chaw on, past tense. I believe it was on last week's show that I talked about synchronicity, and I was referring not to the hit 1983 album Synchronicity by the Police, although the sort of titular song Synchronicity 2, in which somewhere in Scotland a man rages against his frustrations, while in parallel some sort of swamp monster rises out of a lake, is pretty close to what I'm talking about. Those events are coincidental, but they feel like they should be related, as if one man's anger is generating another lake's monster. Synchronicity 2, by the way, only went to number 16 in the United States, while its album mates, Every Breath You Take, went all the way to number 1, and King of Pain peaked at number 3, and even Wrapped Around Your Finger got to number 8. Am I the only one who appreciates a good swamp monster song? The version of Synchronicity I pointed out last week takes place when we learn about something here on the show at the same time that something similar happens in the real world. This episode of The Infinite Inning is going up the third week of May 2025 for anyone who experiences it via time capsule. There was an unusual play in this past Wednesday's game between the Giants and the Diamondbacks at Arizona. It was the bottom of the eighth inning. 2 were out. Second baseman Christian Koss walked. Koss is a 27-year-old rookie, and based on his minor league track record, we probably won't be seeing him take ball 4 all that often. He's just a guy who never developed very much selectivity. The next batter up was left fielder Elliot Ramos. His name is spelled Heliot, which suggests Helios to me, which means Here Comes the Sun plays in my head. Every time I think of him, the mind works in strange ways. Now, Elliot is a power hitter. He is the first right-handed hitter in the history of the Giants' current park to park a home run in McCovey Cove. But in this instance, he just tapped the ball down the third base line, bringing to mind Casey Stengel's line about how could a guy who's so big and strong hit the ball so near? Eugenio Suarez made a nice play to grab it, but his throw to first base was a bit wide, and it dragged Pavin Smith off the bag. Smith recovered and saw Koss lying in the dirt just past second base and threw over to rookie Jordan Lawler, who tagged Koss, now apparently extinct. Just to forestall any worry, as far as I know, Koss was, as the shop owner said in the Parrot sketch, merely stunned. That was the third out, inning over. The question was, why had Koss chosen that particular moment to take a nap? What had happened was that Lawler, thinking Suarez might try to make a force play at second, had just stood right on the second base bag. When the play went to first base, he just kept standing there. Meanwhile, Koss, who was also following the play, plowed right into Lawler and bounced off of him like bullets bounce off of Superman and just collapsed. And if you watch a replay, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that had Koss seen Lawler and tried to get out of the way, he would have had to veer about 6 miles off course, either way over towards the pitcher's mound or out into the outfield. Well, the umpires looked at that, talked it over, and concluded that Koss had been obstructed. The out was erased, and Koss was placed back on second. Diamondbacks manager Torey Lovullo was very upset about this, and the fun part of the aftermath was that Lovullo argued for a very long time. He was finally ejected, and then he went around to all 4 umpires, pointing at them, and ejected them too. I feel certain that at some point in my life I've seen Earl Weaver or Billy Martin or someone do that, but it's been a long time, and I can't point to an exact event just now. But what was more fun for me was that at almost precisely that same moment, I had traveled in our infinite inning time machine back to New York on September 27th, 1928, when the Giants were hosting the Chicago Cubs. Now, when time traveling, it's very important to specify not just time and date, but location, because our planet moves around a lot, and if you just try to get back to a given date from where Earth is sitting right now, you might materialize into empty space. As Albert Einstein once said to me, time travel is complicated, dude, except he said it in German, so it came out sounding something like Zeitreisen sind kompliziert, mein Freund, and I didn't understand a word he was saying. Now, this was what you might call a big, important honking ball game. There was, depending on the team, 5 or 6 games left in the season. The St. Louis Cardinals were in first place by 1 game over the Giants. The Cubs were third, 5 back in the loss column. I don't think they had been eliminated yet, but if they were still breathing, it was one of those unlikely scenarios in which they'd have to win out and the Cardinals would have to drop all their remaining games. The Cubs came pretty close to holding up their end of the bargain, actually, but the Cards did not cooperate. The Giants, though, at this moment were very much alive and had to keep winning. The game in question was the first of two that the Cubs and Giants played that Thursday. The Giants sent out a rookie lefty, Carl Hubble, not yet the meal ticket. That nickname and a couple of most valuable player awards was still a few years away. The Giants countered with a left-hander of their own, Art Neff, which balked me for half a second because, in my mind, he's also a Giant. A 20-game winner on 2 championship teams, no less. Thing is, he was getting near the end, and so John McGraw had traded him out, or sold him out, actually. The Giants got ahead early, going up 1-0 in the second on a Freddie Lindstrom single, followed by, drumroll please, Shanty Hogan's RBI double. It's good to have Shanty back on the show, isn't it? The Cubs came back with 2 runs of their own when their shortstop, Woody English, hit what might have been a routine 6-3 grounder to short. It was fielded by Travis Jackson, but first baseman Bill Terry just plumb missed the throw. The Cubs added 1 more in the 4th when center fielder Hack Wilson led off with a triple, and left fielder Rick Stevenson, a .336 hitter, don't you know, singled him home. Cubs 3, Giants 2. We cut to the bottom of the 6th. It was still 3-2 Cubbies. Shanty came up with runners on second and third and no outs. Now here are your other dramatis personae. The runner on third base was Giants second baseman Andy Cohen. The Cubs catcher was future Hall of Famer Charles "Gabby" Hartnett. Shanty tapped back to the pitcher, Neff. Cohen broke for home. Neff threw to Cubs third baseman Clyde Beck, that is behind Andy Cohen. That's Clyde Eugene Beck, not Charles Clarence Beck, co-creator of Captain Marvel, but you can still say the magic word if you want. Cohen was now in a rundown. Beck chased him toward home. Just like Jordan Lawler this week, Hartnett straddled the baseline, awaiting the throw. Reese tried to get around him. They collided. Cohen fell to his hands and knees, and Beck tagged him out from behind just a few feet short of the plate. I put up a couple of good pictures of the play at the Facebook group, and initially they look a bit like they're dancing. The Giants, in the person of John McGraw, argued interference. In this instance, umpire Bill Clem made the opposite call from the one the umps in the present-day Giants game did. His reasoning, it's not obstruction if the fielder has a legitimate reason to be where he was, that is, to make a play. That is still part of Rule 6.01. If a fielder is about to receive a thrown ball, and if the ball is in flight directly toward and near enough to the fielder, so he must occupy his position to receive the ball, he may be considered in the act of fielding a ball. It is entirely up to the judgment of the umpire as to whether a fielder is in the act of fielding a ball. Clem felt that Hartnett was where he should have been because he was trying to be part of the rundown. The Giants played the game under protest, but as the rule I just quoted said, it's a judgment call, and the NL president wasn't going to overrule on a spot judgment of that kind, and he did not. It isn't a rules violation, it's an interpretation of a moment in time, and it's very hard to second guess that. Even today, you can't appeal that via replay, because replay is good at revealing what happened, but it can't tell you how to understand it. Paul Gallico, whose post-sports writing stories are still being made into movies and TV shows, wrote in the New York Daily News, "Hartnett was a solid wall hiding the plate. Andy plunged into him, toppled him, scrambled for the plate with spikes and nails, and was collared by Beck. Hartnett got up, limping and laughing. Clem ruled Reese out. The rule pertaining to a man's freedom on the base paths says no runner shall be interfered with by a player not in possession of the ball. But ball games are won on the field and not in offices. Gabby got away with it." Now that was how Paul Gallico understood it, but he wasn't necessarily right. Some of the other sports writers were in agreement with him, though, and started a bit of a crusade in the New York papers to get rid of Bill Clem. Clem, the old arbitrator as he was called, was an NL ump for 46 years and was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1953, so you can guess how successful that campaign was, but oh boy did Clem resent it, and he thought McGraw was behind it. They had a very strange relationship. He and McGraw argued a lot on the field. Clem ejected him 16 or 17 times. They were friends, however, off the field with a common interest in horse racing, which, by the way, bothered the hell out of Judge Landis back in the days when baseball worried about things like ball players, managers, and umpires running up big debts to gamblers. So they fell into kind of a routine, and their careers overlapped for 27 years, so this must have happened a lot. During the day, McGraw would scream and kick dirt at Clem and call him nasty names, and then at night he would take him out to dinner. Today we would call this an abusive relationship with a beating followed by a love bombing. It was such a bipolar thing that it threw Clem because McGraw was one of the most vitriolic people ever on the field, but he could be very cordial the rest of the time, assuming decent enough sobriety. So are you friends or not? Because a friend wouldn't ever treat you this way, even if you did call a pitch on the black a ball. In his memoirs, Clem said, "I got a bit bored with McGraw's abuse followed by invitation to dinner, and I told him so. He said, 'Bill, please don't feel that way. The tougher the battle we have on the field, the quicker. You must have dinner with me.' I never felt so sorry for John McGraw in my life." Me too, Bill. Me too. But that fall, he ran into McGraw at the track during this whole kerfuffle about this rundown play and said, "We're through this time and for all time." And I don't know if they ever did patch it up. The Cubs kept the Giants off the board the rest of the way, and so the final score was, as it had been, 3-2 Cubs. The Giants lost one they couldn't afford to lose. But it's a long season, and it's hard to point to any one game as the culprit. I mean, the Giants, for 60 other reasons, had a final record of 93-61 and finished 2 games behind the Cardinals. But that didn't stop the writers. They kept on going right on into the winter, talking about how Hartnett held Reese by an obvious football tackle. Coincidentally or not, Clem, who had umpired about 10 World Series to that point in his career, wasn't picked for the 1928 Fall Classic between the Cards and the Yankees. And in December, he quit. The National League president, John Heidler, asked him to reconsider. According to Clem, he said, "I'll umpire again, but not unless the Giants acknowledge to a newspaper wire service that my decision was 100% correct and that they are arguing the wrong rule." Heidler said he would try to make it happen and also gave Clem a raise, and the Giants did make that statement, and so he came back. To Torey Lovullo's credit, none of the quartet of umpires who he evicted, Nick Marley, Mark Ripperger, Edwin Jimenez, and Nick Lentz, had to resign to get an apology. After the game, he admitted he had just gotten carried away and that the umpires had made the right call. If I haven't made it clear, the 2 obstruction arguments are a little different. Once Jordan Lawler was out of the play being made on Elliot Ramos, he was obligated to get the heck out of the baseline. That's cut and dried. Looking back at the pictures of the Beck-Hartnett rundown on Cohen, it's clear that Hartnett both was and wasn't part of the play. Beck never did throw to Hartnett. He just herded Cohen towards Hartnett, who functioned as a wall. As long as there was the potential for Beck to throw to Hartnett, it was legitimate for Hartnett to be there. But since Beck never did, Hartnett the wall was illegal. And all of these transitions between legal and illegal roles, possible participant to non-participating obstacle, took place in fractions of seconds and really were a judgment call about potential. And so Hartnett was both right and wrong, which means Clem was both right and wrong. But I think more wrong than right. The moment that Hartnett became part of the play without the ball, he was obstructing Andy Cohen. It's a lacuna in the rules, a hole that no one has ever bothered to patch. It seems impossible that it has never come up again in nearly 100 years, but maybe it hasn't. You can find those spots in every system of rules. The American Constitution says that Congress has the power to enact any law it deems necessary and proper to carry out its listed functions, which in practical terms means it can pass things that aren't part of its listed functions. Then the 10th Amendment says that rights not given to the federal government are reserved for the states, which further limits Congress, although you can also read it as trying to say that just because we didn't think of any right a state might possibly have doesn't mean that they don't have it. We just don't have the time and space to list them all. The Ninth Amendment, which I'd swear no one ever talks about, says something similar. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Just because we forgot to mention it, it doesn't mean you don't have it. Your rights are more numerous than any list we can make. Your liberty is only constrained in the places we have agreed that it is. Otherwise, go have fun, you crazy kids. Only it usually hasn't worked out that way. It's usually interpreted as, you don't have the right to be on the grass. Keep off the grass. It's not listed, therefore no grass for you. And then there are executive orders, which the Constitution doesn't mention at all. They just happened because presidents, starting right with George Washington, if I recall correctly, needed a vehicle to direct his government as to how to execute laws passed by Congress, not create laws, but execute them. And in that space lies more questions of judgment, just like the one that confronted umpire Bill Clem. If Congress were to pass a law saying that all Americans must jump up in the air and never come down without specifying the means of their doing it, the president could, in theory, write an executive order directing various law enforcement agencies to run around the country seizing people and forcing them into jetpacks. That's not an enforcement exactly, it's also an elaboration. The courts could review that order, but judicial review isn't in the Constitution either. One reason that document is a mess is because creating a new government was not what those delegates to the convention were supposed to be doing, and it also was taking forever, and they just wanted to go home. Thus, they mostly skipped things like the judiciary system. The larger problem was not just wanting to get the hell out of Philadelphia, but that you can't anticipate everything. Humans are endlessly inventive, and they're going to find holes to exploit, no matter how long you stay or how much you write. Now, if the people who find those holes are ethical, then they honor the patches you slap on those holes, or they understand the spirit of what you wrote and understand that the hole is in contravention of that spirit. If they're not ethical, they push an army through that hole, and you know how it works. Well, mostly you do. We haven't seen it for ourselves, not yet. So far, the only consequence is runners down in the lanes. Speaking of being down, if the current score of the Rockies game holds up, they will have only 7 wins after 44 games, and that ain't never happened before. 4 teams have been 9-35, not 7-37. Speaking of 37, you can be my 37th follower on social media. Just go to stephengoldman.bsky.social. Should you want to write us, by which I mean me, you can do so at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning. You'll find those pictures of the Andy Cohen rundown I mentioned tonight. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at teespring.com/stores/the-infinite-inning. Original soundtrack available gratis at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. I actually found one I didn't know about this week, and there were all kinds of nice comments there, so thank you very much. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, you should go to that one. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who says, "I believe that logic is the future. Teach it now and let it lead the way. Let us reason before we..." Too late. Well, if the dish doesn't run away with the spoon in some kind of polyamorous flatware circle, forcing the honey bear to eat wheat checks with his bare paws, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.